speak for everyone, reluctant to bring those in. But now we have our third panel, Belonging and Resistance, and I am happy to introduce our first panelist, and this is Jamel Watkins. Jamel Watkins is a postdoctoral fellow in German studies at Stanford University. She received her PhD in German studies from UMass Amherst in 2017. She's interested in race and gender in contemporary German society. Her current book project, Roses for Angela, deals with the East German fandom of Angela Davis. Today, she shares part of an article she is currently writing on Black hair in Germany. Thank you. Welcome, Jamel.
Thank you. In this paper, I consider the ways in which hair becomes a significant marker for race for Afro-Germans, regardless of gender, especially in a majority white nation that often rejects Blackness. And also, just so that you know, in this paper, I will refer to Afro-German and Black German synonymously. I demonstrate the complexity of hair for Black Germans, oftentimes signifying a negative trait that they need to change, and other times representing a space for self-love, empowerment, community, and acceptance. Using personal narratives, autobiography, and film, I illustrate the impact of growing up with Black hair in Germany and how that brings these people to a process of self-love. I provide a close analysis of those different mediums in order to show that these seemingly banal and small moments are actually quite impactful and have a larger significance in German society. Here has a larger relevance, examining literary and film examples of the toxic discourses regarding Black hair in Germany. These works serve as an intervention to counter those toxic environments and transform negative connotations of Black hair. Many Black feminists and womanist theorists have researched beauty standards in Blackness, or that is to say, the multiple ways that whiteness does not allow for Black beauty to be possible. Bell Hooks describes the way the beauty standard has always been a white beauty standard by saying, quote, exposing the myriad of ways white supremacy has assaulted our self-concept and our self-esteem, militant leaders of Black liberation struggle demanded that Black folks see ourselves differently. See self-love has a radical political agenda, end quote. Validating different types of beauty and unsubscribing from white beauty standards serve as self-love. Rejecting those Anglo-European standards requires a deprogramming of sorts and going against everything Black people have been taught. Instead, it entails redefining beauty on their own terms. Hair care and styles are just one important way Black women can see themselves differently. Beyond adornment, it enables curating a self-image that is positive and empowering. In the article, Decolonizing My Hair, Unshackling My Curls in Autoethnography, Carolette Norwood reflects on her own hair journey and also engages with Patricia Hill Collins on knowledges, consciousnesses, and empowerment. One particular powerful passage on rebellion in Black hair is relevant for my discussion of Folashade. Norwood reveals, quote, embracing the natural Black aesthetic is often read as rebellion, and in some ways it has to be. It is the reality of Black-skinned people who can decide that they are just fine the way God made them and choose not to adhere to Western white standards. Not to stand invisible or neutral within the white norm essentially means standing deviant and in rebellion, end quote. Norwood's reading of her own hair journey as inherently political is also relevant for Germany, where the traditional standards of blonde hair and blue eyes are even more extreme. Black Germans do not fit into the norm of beauty and citizenship and are excluded from both. In a piece from Kleine 3, which actually means less than 3, but is written as a little sideways heart, the blogger Alice comments on how Black women do not fit the Western beauty standards like Norwood, and considers her hair as a political statement. She explains, meine Haare sind kraus und schwarz. Sie sind das buchstäbliche Gegenteil vom westlichen Schönheitsideal blond und glatt. Und deswegen stehen meine Haare genau am anderen Ende der Schönheitshierarchie unten, end quote. That is particularly Black hair has the least beautiful or ugly it is remarkable that when Black Germans do choose to wear their natural hair. Berlin-based Afro-Portuguese critical theorist and artist Greta Colomba considers the social and cultural relevance of hair within the Black and African diaspora in her book Plantation Memories. Colomba recognizes the significance of Black hair because historically it was associated with enslavement. Colomba clarifies, more than skin color, hair became the most potent mark of servitude during the enslavement period. Black hair became a symbol of primitivity, disorder, inferiority, and uncivilization. African hair was then classified as bad hair. At the same time, Black people were pressured to relax bad hair with appropriate chemicals developed by European industries. As Colomba proves, bad hair is so often synonymous with Black hair. There's a history of Black people manipulating their hair to appease those who have oppressed them in the past and present, which is another type of oppression because Black people can never simply just be. Within the context of Germany, it is important to remember in the discussion of race and hair, there were real-life ramifications for not having blonde, straight hair for Afro-Germans like Hans Hauch and others who lived during the Third Reich. In her book, Other Germans, Tina Camp describes, quote, the Nazi sterilization of Black children of the Rhineland occupation represents one of the most extreme consequences of the discourses of race and racial purity that converged in the Rhineland campaign, as well as the most concrete response to the threat posed by this imaginary specter, end quote. Hauch explains that the Aryan paragraph quite clearly defined who was German or of a related race, and of course this Aryan paragraph excluded him and the other Black Germans. This anxiety around pure race was has a heightened meaning in the German space, a striking difference from other Black diasporic groups. While there are many similarities among Black diasporic communities, it is important not to forget the very real racial anxiety manifested through hair in Germany during the Nazi period and beyond. For instance, Hauch explains that he straightened his hair with sugar because he wanted blue eyes and blonde hair. Next, he discussed that his failed attempt to straighten his, what he calls kinky hair, with the sugar. His source of pride in his identity exists in between these moments, but for him, this happened after many, many years. So hair is so often a gendered marker associated with women, but it also impacts Afro-German men. In his autobiography, Destined to Witness, former editor of Ebony, Hans Massaquoi, describes his relationship with his hair. He first mentions hair in his autobiography as he entered school the first time. In order to be less conspicuous, his mother had cut his hair off. He explains, quote, but my fear of teachers, which I shared with most school beginners, was only one of my problems. My biggest worry, which I tried to keep to myself, was having to face hundreds of strange children and the certainty of racial taunts and ridicule. In an obvious attempt to make me less conspicuous, my mother told my barber, albeit with a heavy heart, to get rid of my generous afro, which I wore decades before it became the rage in the United States, and that my mother loved as much as I detested it, end quote. With his quotation, he indicates how much hair was a huge priority. His attempts to fit in, though, were in vain. A classmate taunted him by touching his hair and calling him the N-word. Massaquoi describes his rage with the boy who put his hand on my head and mockingly stroked my hair. Why do Negroes grow sheep wool instead of hair on their heads, he asked me. To which Massaquoi responds by kicking him. Hair was significant for him as a child, and his attempt at fitting in, that's cutting his hair, was unsuccessful. Massaquoi was teased for his skin color and hair, both marking him as an outsider in Germany. Trying to pass in the German context was another option. In the narrative, in the groundbreaking work Farbe bekennen, Helga Emde discusses the pains she took in order to try to fit in or pass in German society. Emde did not want to deal with the constant accusations that she did not belong or hear comments about her physical appearance. And she reveals, quote, when I was about 13, I started to straighten my, she called it horse hair, so that it would look more like white people's hair that I admired so much. I was convinced that with straight hair, I would look conspicuous. I would squeeze my lips together so that they appeared less puffy. everything to make myself beautiful and less conspicuous. So I'm going to draw your attention here to her word choice. First, she labels her own hair as horsehair. This trope of black hair has horsehair has global stereotypes that simultaneously points to issues of character and appearance. The horsehair trope signals a wildness of character and to the appearance of dark, unruly hair, of course, also to false hair, like weave. She links herself to an animal. This is something that white people have done to black people for centuries, colonialism. Next, she admits that she admired white people's hair. And finally, we get to the point that straight hair would help her fit in and not have to deal with being a marginalized person in a majority white society. Then she addresses her lips, where she says that she tries to squeeze her lips together. Another aspect of black appearance that has been stereotyped through visual culture, famously characterized in racial imagery from the colonial period to the present. She describes making her lips thin to resemble white German lips. However, the adjective that she uses is puffy, which is also a descriptor of hair. Again, she repeats the phrase, doing all of this desiring to minimize the microaggression she receives, and then, of course, likening fitting in to beauty. Hairstyling can provide emotional support for fictional Afro-German protagonists. I'd like to analyze the impact of hair in the film using Bremen Opaco's Tal der Ahnungslosen. This film features a black East German woman who is in search of her birth mother. We see her as she moves into her apartment in Dresden. After an uneventful trip to the Stasi archive, the protagonist, Eva, meets another black woman, Julia, on a bridge. Because it's raining, the black woman shares her umbrella with Eva and says, "Na, hast du deinen Regenschirm vergessen?" And anyway, the conversation goes on, and I have it here, but in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of spring forward a little bit. But the black stranger basically provides stranger for Eva after a very overwhelming and unsatisfying trip to the Stasi archive to find information about her mother. And Eva compliments the black woman's hair, which I also realized later I did my hair the exact same way from the woman on the bridge. Maybe that was subconscious, I don't know. But this is what her hair looks like. And Julia says that she could do it for her. This conversation in the film is striking because Eva meets someone unassociated with her search for her birth mother, or a coworker, right? Julia is practically a stranger. However, there is intimacy in their interaction. Meeting this other black woman sparks the topic of hair immediately, and Julia provides a glimpse at the possibility of friendship. Later, Eva finds the address of her birth mother, shows up to her home, and sees her half-sister arguing with the mother. Frustrated about the timing and unable to insert herself into the scene, Eva flees. Hitting the dash with yellow flowers, she drives away. Crying, Eva calls her new acquaintance, Julia, to do her hair. This hair scene is touching for several reasons. First, Eva goes to Julia after a frustrating encounter with her birth family. The failed connection to them leads her to reach out to Julia, another black woman in town. While she's still crying, Eva asks for more than hair care. In the next scene, we see a hot comb on the stove. And doing hair in the kitchen is significant because, of course, it's necessary to heat up the hot comb on the stove, but also it's a place where black mothers have done their black children's hair for generations. And of course, Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde have talked about the kitchen space as being a space particularly empowering for black women. Second, unable to receive motherly love and care, Eva gains it from Julia. In this scene, the film cuts between the straightening of Eva's natural hair and the package of documents she sent to her birth mother, and of course its journey via the Deutsche Post. The viewer follows the package of Eva's story travel, and simultaneously the viewer witnesses Eva being cared for and transformed in another way through hair. In truth, Julia only straightens her hair and does not create the double bun hairstyle that Julia had herself on the bridge. From the smoke of the hot comb fills the kitchen, and Julia opens up the window, which of course is funny if you've ever experienced that firsthand. And we see Eva looking unsatisfied, which again gives black viewers another flashback to their childhoods about being unsatisfied when their mothers are doing their hair in the kitchen. But we can see that Julia was unable to give Eva the fulfillment that she needed. Her attempt to straighten her hair was less about an effort to fit in. It's more about a desire to forge a connection with someone to establish fictive kinship. Eva was not worried about being inconspicuous. Instead, she wanted to be more like the Black woman she met on the bridge, so this is a different moment from the other earlier moments of trying to fit in. In a flashback in the orphanage, Eva puts on a yellow knit hat with long braided ear flaps. These strings resemble two pigtails. Young Eva puts on the hat and twirls in front of the mirror and admires her new hair. The nun in the orphanage tells her to take off the hat and line up with the other girls, but of course Eva wants to keep it on. And the more aggressively, the nun tells her to take it off again, and Eva claims that this hat is her hair. The other girls giggle, and of course Eva is punished. This scene is important because, again, this flashback shows the significance of long blonde hair and the desirability of it for the protagonist. In a film about family, these hair scenes are important moments that speak to sense of self, identity, and acceptance during various points of Eva's life. Her hair was key to that. While the film is about familial connection and telling truth about the past, there are many significant scenes and moments that revolved around hair that exemplify the common experiences of Black Germans. As a final example, the Deutsche Welle film Afro-Deutschland also focuses on hair. The short film begins with close-ups of the Black German journalist Jana Praigis washing her hair. After it's dry, she straightens it. Her voice starts the video documentary saying, "Das Bild, das Deutsche weiß sind, blond sind und blaue Augen haben. Das stimmt ja nie und das wird nie stimmen. Das ist ein Mythos." Praigis travels to Hamburg to meet her old friend, Black German hip-hop artist and producer Samy Deluxe. They discuss their multiracial background and the pressure they feel from others who ask them what it's like to be hin und her gerissen between two cultures, to which Praigis says it's just a normal state of being. Samy Deluxe explains that his straight hair caused him a fair amount of confusion. Kids called him the N-word but took it back, commenting on his straight hair. In his case, hair is the singular signifier of Blackness. And in the rest of the film, I don't have it here, I kind of cut it for time, but in the rest of the film, she goes to an Afro shop to get her hair done, and she gets her natural curls back, and she speaks to Esther Duncore of Afrolocken, which is the blog, and she wears her natural hair for the rest of the film, so she kind of goes through this process on screen. In this paper, I've shown how hair is a significant marker for race for many Afro-Germans. From the Third Reich to the present day, Black Germans speak out against white beauty standards, specifically the myth of blonde straight hair. I've examined many examples from multiple sources to show that these seemingly slight moments, when added together, offer a strong statement about how important hair was for their formative years and beyond. Across genders and generations, there is a notion of needing time to process the fact that straight blonde hair is not attainable and it's not beautiful, and eventually finding one's own hair beautiful. Embracing Afrolocken allows Black Germans to position themselves in a white society, making their presence more visible. With the growing popularity of YouTubers, blogs, physical salons like Ebony and Ivory in Berlin, Black Germans assert that their natural hair is beautiful, leaving white beauty standards behind. Thank you.
And next up, we have Folashade Ajayi. Folashade holds a bachelor's degree in social science from Humboldt University, Berlin, where she is currently completing her MA in the same subject, focusing on anti-discrimination in general and anti-racism, gender equality, and migration policies in particular. These are topics that are close to her heart and that she applies in her long-standing activist work. Based in Berlin, she is a member of the Initiative of Black People in Germany, ISD. In that role, she co-organized the first European network meeting of people of African descent in 2014 and represented the organization at various events in Brussels, Vienna, and New York. She expanded her knowledge in the field of anti-discrimination, both on the national and European level, interning at Germany's Federal Anti-Discrimination Agency, as well as the European Network Against Racism in Brussels. Since 2013, Folashade is a research assistant at Humboldt University's Department of Diversity and Social Conflict, where she gathers additional experience in academia. Since 2016, she's an elected member of the Humboldt University Staff Committee, pushing for more inclusive hiring processes and working conditions. Folashade is a fellow of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and Humanity in Action. She's lived and worked in Germany, Belgium, South Africa, and speaks German, English, and French. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Hello, so in my presentation I'm spanning a period of roughly 30 years talking about the more recent Black activist work in Germany starting around 1985 until today. And I call it recent forms of Black activist work or Black political organizing, as Black people's presence in Germany dates back centuries ago, and like all oppressed groups, Black people have always resisted against racism and different forms of oppression one way or the other. Also, I want to make clear that both past and present Black activist work that I will talk about will only be a selection of projects and initiatives. As a member of the initiative Black People in Germany, ISD, I'm drawing a lot from this organization's history and field of activities, noting that there are many other Black-led organizations like BGHRA, standing for Black Women in Germany, or the Zentralrat der Afrikanischen Gemeinde, Central Council of the African Community, and these are also key organizations when thinking about Black political organizing in Germany or Berlin. Yes, so given the conference's topic, I will talk in particular about aspects that to me have a striking transnational dimension to it. And I named the title of my talk, Making Diversity Work and Fight. In order to contextualize Black activism and to know what we are fighting against, I will very briefly first outline racism in Germany in general and anti-Black racism in particular. And I also just want to make a disclaimer that I do not address anti-Black racism coming from other racialized groups, which is hardly talked about in social justice spaces in Germany. Yes, so the denazification policy imposed on Germany by the Allied forces after the Second World War remained on the surface without dismantling or even naming the mechanism, patterns, and structures that led to German German Nazi era. Rather, the moral rhetoric was quickly adopted that racism is bad, a disease even. It resulted in racism being made a taboo subject that nobody wants to be identified with, lasting until today. Instead of seeing racism as an inherent and structural element of Germany's society, interwoven with Germany's colonial past, it is framed as a marginal phenomenon, and Germany's colonial history is hardly touched upon. If racism is ever addressed, it refers either to marginal groups such as racist or right-wing extremist groups whose racism is then portrayed as rooted in individualized hatred and stereotypes, or is completely detached from societal structures at large. Making racism a taboo and downplaying its structural character and the racist experience that affected groups make is a strategy to maintaining the status quo and existing power structures. Another strategy to deal or not to deal with racism is its externalization. For the rare occasion when racism is talked about, it is often happening elsewhere and most probably in the US, while highlighting that the few racist incidents in Germany do not amount to racism, and by far the German or the US case cannot be compared, and therefore racism either does not exist in Germany or is portrayed as something exceptional. This goes hand in hand with upholding a colonial amnesia and the fact that Black people are erased from Germany's history. Therefore, Black people are perceived as a new minority, as the newly arrived in Germany, despite Black people's century-old presence. Germany is a country with a dominant narrative, imagining itself as a homogeneously white nation or folk. But what is whiteness really? Whiteness is whiteness is a constructed identity that only works in negation and exclusion to the other, that is created to serve this purpose. Therefore, whiteness depends on blackness and the colonial dichotomy between Europe or whiteness being civilized and rational, and Africa or blackness being uncivilized or incapable of rationality. Thus, German is a hostile environment for black people as a visible minority in terms of structures, institutions, day-to-day life. And being black and German, which for me is being a black person in Germany, regardless of her or his citizenship status or nationality, is seen as an impossibility. This explains also why people address me, often very much taking pride in their international competences or English language skills, by addressing me in English. In Berlin, Germany's capital, with an international branding, I'm seen as a foreigner, a tourist, a migrant, regardless of whether or not I was born and raised in Germany, and regardless of the nationality that my passport might convey. Just 2 days ago, I spoke with a friend of mine about how we experience racism in Germany, and she recounted a situation when, as a dark-skinned black woman, she was asked in an interview situation how she identifies herself. When she said that she identifies as an Afro-German person or a black German, the 3 white men interviewing her started laughing. Hearing this really moved me, and it not only shows that being black and German is seen as an impossibility, it is also a laughable matter. And these are just 2 examples of everyday racism. However, these are the same mechanisms for everyday racism that make some bodies being seen more or less valuable than others, more or less worthy of being granted a life and dignity, or even worthy of empathy. Because racism kills not only related to racist attacks, but also when looking at European migrant or containment policies that are highly racialized and that cost the lives of so many people who die on their way to make it to Europe. I assume that response to these human-made tragedies would be different if the people who die because of them were not black or brown. Also, there are nuances of anti-black racism that shape our experiences and do make a difference that needs to be acknowledged within the black community as well. What is often being glossed over is that experiences of anti-black racism are diverse, and although the white gaze has mastered identifying markers of racialized difference, anti-black racism can be different depending on the color of your skin. Whether or not you're a dark-skinned woman or light-skinned woman like me does influence the way you are seen, treated, and partly included, and the way you can navigate through spaces. Yes, with that being said, I now turn to how black political organizing was fueled in the 1980s. So with a long history of anti-black racism in Germany, black people could relate to and learn from the civil rights movement in the US, as well as black theory and literature. However, it was particularly the influence of black feminist thought and the work of Audre Lorde that kickstarted black political organizing in Germany. Audre Lorde, for whom it was important to identify as a black woman, lesbian, poet, mother, warrior, was a visiting professor of literature at Free University Berlin in the early 1980s and drew to her classes many women and feminists. During these classes, she encouraged a group of young black German women of different origins to not leave the room before they had spoken to one another. Some of the women had already been involved in the women's and lesbian movement in Germany. On this, Marion Kraft writes, I quote, "The white feminist movement was neither very concerned about the issue of racism nor interested in works by black women. As a result, the black German women's movement emerged in the 1980s was more connected to black feminists in the United States. The black lesbian writer, poet, and activist Audre Lorde was particularly active in forming transnational bridges," end quote. These women coming together and sharing their experiences was the beginning of a community building process that turned out to be the foundation of different forms of political activism. Peggy Piche emphasizes the role of a perspective, or better to say, a way to engage with one another, promoted by Audre Lorde in her text on the creative powers of difference. This perspective is centered around learning from and acknowledging the complexities of our lives and giving nuance to the Black experience. It allows to give room for differences and to highlight different aspects of our intersectional lives, shaping our experiences while seeing a common ground for community building and resistance. This was linked to the creation of safe spaces, or better to say, safer spaces, a concept stemming from feminist thought and practice that allowed to exchange experiences and develop support systems, as well as art project actions and campaigns centering a Black perspective. The history of Black political organizing in Germany proves the importance of language both for identity formation and resistance, which is beautifully described in Audre Lorde's famous text, The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action. Especially the coining of the term Afro-German was key to political activism in Germany. Not only was it the first time that Black people could name and identify themselves with a non-derogatory term, also it left enough room for encompassing the differences of the diverse Black or Afro-German community in Germany. This self-definition not only created a collective identity, moreover, it added to a more politicized language that in turn fueled discussions as well as political mobilization. These processes and work of Black lesbian women in particular led to the formation of several organizations such as ADEFRA, Afro-German Women, or Black Women in Germany, and the ISD, Initiative for Black People in Germany. That was in 1985 or 1986. Many projects and initiatives followed with the establishment of the Black History Month, the publication of books and magazines such as Afrikete or Afrolocken, or the first demonstration against racism organized by Black people in Berlin in 1991 in the context of a spike in racist sentiments and attacks in the wake of Germany's reunification. And this was just to name a few examples. I want to especially highlight the book Farbe bekennen, showing our colors by Maya Yim and Karina Oguntoye. It was published in 1986 and showcased the lives and experiences of Afro-German women spanning several generations. It was a key contribution to the rewriting of German history. And on this, Sasha Sinflu points out that the blank page of knowledge on Black people's history and presence in Germany also offered a possibility for Black people to narrate their own stories, following an understanding that the reclaiming of Black history is a form of resistance itself that challenges the dominant narrative of Germany being a homogeneously white nation. Also, it challenged the dominant perception that racism did not exist in Germany, downplaying the experience, complaints, and testimonies made by racialized groups in Germany. There were workshops, readings, and exhibitions around the book throughout Germany, which then supported the coming together of Black people and other racialized groups. The book also validated my own experience in Germany and finally gave me the vocabulary to talk about racism when I read it at the age 22. I grew up in a predominantly white environment in Bielefeld, a relatively big city in the northwest of Germany, with a very small Black population at that time. So 20 years after this book was published, I had to actively seek this knowledge and kind of look for my own, for vocabulary to talk about my own experiences. But what does that mean, actually? It shows that this knowledge is still marginalized and that mainstream society is resilient against it. Basically, it shows that we still have a long way to go. And this was just a very brief description of the German context. And fast forward to today's context and work, and building on what I just presented, much work continues to be done in different areas, such as decolonizing the public space or the fight against racial profiling and police brutality. I also do not want to simply list different areas of activist work that would focus heavily on the ISD, and leave out other organizations' work. If people are interested in that, we can talk maybe afterwards about that. Rather, I thought of what exactly the transnational dimensions of Black political activism aimed at combating racism and intersecting forms of discrimination affecting people in Germany could be like. And also while preparing this talk, I thought a lot about how I should describe it. I first wanted to say that resistance has become more transnational, but then, for example, looking at Audre Lorde's impact on Black political organizing in Germany, I realized that it has always been transnational or transnationally influenced. So what I think is more accurate is that apart from transnational connections and influences in a globalized world, there is an increased effort to create transnational networks operating at the European level. For example, in 2014, the first European network meeting for people of African descent was held in Berlin, bringing together activists from different Black activists from 15 European countries. And that led then to the formation of the European Network of People of African Descent, NPAD, consisting of Black-led self-organizations throughout Europe. And the aim is to jointly address anti-Black racism and taking into account different national contexts as well. Moreover, the European Union and international structures and institutions are increasingly used by Black anti-racist lobbyists. They are using different channels, such as working with members of the European Parliament and organizing hearings within the European Parliament or the European Commission to address anti-Black racism and to push forward their demands. Just last week, I attended the first ever People of African Descent Week that was held in the European Parliament, and it also brought together activists, members of the European Parliament, and policymakers from the local, national, and European level in an effort to push for a pan-European approach to tackle anti-Black racism. And also while being aware that the European Union plays a key role in maintaining European continental racism, when looking at its migration policies, for example, Black civil society organizations are using these European Union structures and referring to the legally binding anti-discrimination directive. So this can be seen as a necessary strategy to create supranational pressure onto nation states, given their lack of political will to tackle racism. And this is also a necessity in that racism and anti-Black racism are European phenomena, and that right-wing and racist movements throughout Europe are also increasingly working together across borders. So given that we don't have time, I would just... Okay, okay. So then also the conversation that I just had with a friend of mine 2 days ago also made me rethink this presentation, and I also wanted to highlight the aspect of conflict and power dynamics within Black activist spaces in Berlin, which is the context where I come from. And as Black people are very diverse when talking about and when talking about Black activism, the same questions regarding who is speaking for whom arise. Gender, class, disability are also important dimensions which are often not addressed or not taken into account within social justice spaces. And also the aspect of colorism is at play when thinking of who's able to talk, who's heard, and whose knowledge is out there for a long time already, but when do we start listening to it? Yeah, so in general, I think we have to ask ourselves how that this class and colorism is remain a big challenge for anti-racist and all emancipatory movements at large, but are necessary to make differences work and fight for everyone. Thank you.
I'm glad you took the time to make that final point. Yeah, I think it's going to be important for our discussion. So finally, I'd like to introduce Dr. Melba Joyce Boyd. She is a distinguished professor in African American Studies at Wayne State University in Detroit and an adjunct professor in Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. An award-winning author or editor of 13 books, 9 of which are poetry, over 100 essays, and a documentary filmmaker. She is the recipient of the Independent Publishers Award, twice awarded the Library of Michigan Notable Books Award for Poetry, finalist for the NAACP Image Award, and the Award for Poetry, as well as the Nonfiction Award from the Black Caucus of the American Library Association. Boyd's poetry and over 100 essays and creative nonfiction have appeared in anthologies, academic journals, cultural periodicals, and newspapers in the United States and Europe. She has a Doctor of Arts in English from the University of Michigan, an MA and a BA in English from Western Michigan University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joyce Boyd.
So, good afternoon. It's been really inspiring conference, and I always get excited when I hear the young scholars. I can call you young because I'm old. I'm going to depart from presenting a paper per se. What I'm going to do is to talk a little bit about my experience as a Fulbright professor at University of Bremen, 1983-84, and what was particularly unique for me personally, and also what was unique about that moment, I think, globally, in terms of what was happening between the United States, Allied forces, and the Soviet Union. So first of all, I want to indicate how I ended up going to Germany, because it just kind of happened. I did not study German. I knew no German until I got to Germany. I had studied French, Latin, but what happened was a friend of mine had been a Fulbright scholar in Italy, and when he returned to Detroit, I was saying, well, you know, I really would like to spend some time in Europe, and he said, well, he says, I suggest, he said, Italy was really great. He says, but I also gave this talk. I was invited to Bremen, and they're looking to bring someone to the university there who is a person of color, but a person who is a non-traditional scholar. They wanted someone who was also possibly a creative person, as he was. He was also a creative writer as well as a scholar. So he gave me these two names, one of which was Dieter Herms, and he said, write to Dieter and tell him your interests, and also a professor in Italy. So as I was going through this process, I was then received a position as a visiting professor at the University of Iowa. And over the course of time, I got the letter. But I had a professor at the University of Michigan, Professor Rudolf Arnheim. And he's famous for being one of the first scholars to write about film as art. And he was also German Jewish and had to leave during that horrific period in German history, went to Italy, and then eventually ended up in the United States. And he encouraged me to go to Germany. And I was really sort of surprised, you know, at his suggestion. And he said, because of the way that you think and because of your work, he says, I think you'll be more appreciated in Germany. I'm like, oh, well, okay. So he was smarter than me, so I took his advice, and I did get an invitation from the Fulbright Commission to go to Bremen. Now, what's also important is that, number one, I knew nothing about Bremen, but it was the perfect place for me to go. I was born and raised in Detroit, came of age, during the 1960s. I was active in the student activism movement. 1968, we had a student demonstration after Martin Luther King was assassinated, and we made our demands upon the university to establish Black Studies at the university, and also to provide scholarships and funds for economically challenged persons of color, which also not just Black students, but also students of color who could not afford to go to the university, which meant we also brought in a large number of Chicano students, because we're in the western part of the state there, where there were large populations that had come for migrant work and had settled in Michigan. So, that whole movement and the movement against this, the anti-war movement, that was all a part of my college experience, and, asserting for women's rights and so on and so forth. So, all that being said, I end up in Bremen, and I run into a whole generation of what they call 68ers. And I realized that I was a 68er. And the conversations and interactions, also, Bremen is Freihandelsstadt Bremen. It's a free city-state, and it has this amazing history of wanting to remain independent. They had a revolution in 1848 because they didn't want to be a part of Germany. When Hitler was elected, they declared themselves independent again, and Hitler had to send in troops to occupy Bremen because he wasn't having it. But it was just a really, really interesting place to be. And also, since I was born and raised in Detroit, we're talking about a city, of course, at this point, that is predominantly Black. We had just, not too few years ago, had elected a mayor who had been a known communist socialist. It's a city with a very strong civil rights and also labor rights history. So the whole attitude of or an intersection between race and class, as we were talking earlier today, is a big part of the time that I grew up in. We'll talk about the new Detroit later, but during this time, the 1980s, we're talking about a place that was really in the forefront of Black struggle in the United States. So I get to Germany, and the first thing I got to do, of course, is learn how to speak some German. So they sent me to the Goethe Institute, and I'm really struggling. And so and also I'm connected to Broadside Press. There's some mention of Audre Lorde. I knew Audre Lorde. We published her poetry. Broadside Press was an independent publishing house out of Detroit that was founded by Dudley Randall, who was my mentor. And so I write him, I'm like, this German is not working. My head is just going crazy. And he said, go and read some German poetry, and he says, and try to translate. And that was really what I needed, was to go back to feeling and language the way that a poet, feels in language. But also, the other thing was, I was really upset because I knew that the Cold War was coming to an unfortunate head, possibly in Germany. But the thing is, when you're in the United States and they're talking about these issues, you don't see what you see when you're in that space. Like in the United States, even though Trump wants to do this, he wants to have a military parade, you probably heard some of that madness lately. That's not something that they do in the United States. So you don't see tanks and all of this. So all of a sudden, I'm in Germany, and I'm like, oh my God, there were tanks, on trains, there were just everything. It was just absolutely, you knew you were in a war zone. So they send me to Rothenburg up the Tauber. Yeah, everybody's nodding their heads and over the way. And it's medieval town to learn German. And so what I started doing is really writing poetry, because I had to filter all of this anxiety and confusion I was feeling. So what I'm going to do is read some poems and then try to contextualize and to understand what's happening here. So this first poem that I wrote that is it's mostly in English, but there's some German phrases, because I started noticing things, and when I would hear people say stuff, I would write it down, and I'd ask someone who was much better in German, what did this person just say? And then they would tell me, and I write it down. And so this is how I started learning German. So this poem is entitled Wingless Spiders. Helicopters hover over Rothenburg ob der Tauber. A one-armed veteran points at the hour. Herr Bürgermeister, Sie müssen ein Krug Bier trinken, was wir der Drickster Weltkrieg bringen. Green poems are written in blue violets, striping amber. Skeleton's signature, the sidewalks of Bremen. Wir waren dafür, jetzt sind wir tot, was wir der nächste Krieg bringen. In city basements, subway stations, bus stops, and midnight hangs, with their hands in their pockets, they wait. From under America, they climb into flat uniforms like stuffed olives to be served with the limited nuclear war. For blue-eyed children with shaved heads and pierced ears, soldiers bring suitcases singing in Black English. The soul is gone, the spirit is split, the mark ain't worth 25 cents. Party today, die tomorrow, can't even buy a proper stone marker. We will be bagged, tagged, and zipped in see-through heavy-duty plastic. Whisper to Jesus. It was in Rothenburg. I also ran into a Black American soldier, and he introduced me to a young woman who was a Black German. And I was thinking about that today, because when we started talking, and she was very quiet, and he introduced me to her, and he said, she's German. He didn't say she was Black German. She said we're German. But he knew that I knew that she was Black, right? And that was interesting, because she was very shy. But it was my introduction to that. Now, my father had actually fought in World War II and was in Germany, and he fought in Patton's troops, which meant they were the troops that went in to liberate POW camps. And so he actually spent time in Germany after the war was over. And so he had, encounters with ordinary German citizens. And so he had a much broader perception of who the German people were. And he was also encouraged me to go to Germany. And so that was another sort of insight that I took with me. So when I get to Bremen, I'm supposed to teach at Bremen, and I get there and I begin to meet all these different people, and I also meet a Native American brother, and he's a blues musician. Now, the other thing that's interesting when I get to Germany, there's like so much American culture everywhere, but there's a lot of Black culture, especially in Bremen. Bremen at that time, I don't know if it's still true, was the headquarters for the Green Party. And there's just like jazz. I mean, you go into a kneipe, like you can hear Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye. I mean, it is just amazing to me how prevalent Black American culture is, and also how well-read especially persons in my generation and younger, how much Black American literature. I mean, they've read more Black American literature than most of the folks in my neighborhood back in Detroit. And we're having these kinds of conversations, and they're not professors. They're just well-read, students of literature. And so it's just, I feel really at home in a lot of ways, culturally, politically, and then I'm being connected to the poetry community and to the music community, because I also used to play a little jazz myself. And I perform with jazz musicians oftentimes. And so I am really getting into my groove there. And I meet Curtis, and Curtis he's playing blues at this particular place. And we get to be really close friends. And this is a poem that I wrote for Curtis. and it's called Blues Music Sky of Morning. Nobody knows the Indian in the photograph, overlooking the blonde ones sinking around bottle rings in St. Polyeka. Jurgen, who hums my grandmother's hymns, takes me to Curtis, my Cherokee cousin of the skylight eyes, who lays the blues on a piano with a broken hand. In the other, I place the Muskogean alphabet, lost on the trail of tears that separated our ancestors for 141 years. I am Blue Jay of the Amber Eyes. I wear Italian moccasins from Berlin and braided leather from Bremen. Sky Eyes remembers to part his hair, centered with temporal gravity. Encircling smoke inside Kyrene's garden, we drink Ugandan coffee of California smiles. In the distance, the cavalry teases the angry bear at the border. We listen. The earth is a mosaic of cryptic symmetry, chanting in the blues music sky of morning. Finally, I've been there a few months, and our German's getting better. It's going to be worse when I read this poem, but you'll have to forgive me. It's been a couple of years since I've been to Bremen. And this is, understand there's all kinds of demonstrations because they're bringing in these Pershing II cruise missiles, what they call short-range, mid-range nuclear weapons. Now, anybody who's had any science knows there's no such thing as limited nuclear explosion. Once it's out, it's gone, right? So we're protesting in the Marktplatz. I'm wondering, am I ever going to get to teach my class? And we're like, no, this is Bremen. We're going down and we're demonstrating. And it is overwhelming. And so this poem is written after I've been in Germany for about 6 months. And it's a combination of both German and English. To write the 13th Flamingo, I flew from Detroit to Bremen to stand on one leg and wonder. Soon, Germans haben mich gefragt, wie gefällt es Ihnen in Deutschland? Und ich habe gedacht, es gefällt mir rot, weiß und blau, wie ein amerikanisches Drama, with black and brown soldiers drinking Coca-Cola, escorting General Blackjack Pershing reincarnated as a missile through the Black Forest under Sauer Reagan, to wait for Rotkäppchen mit Kermit Cole. Aber ich habe gesagt, vielleicht es ist der unentwundeste amerikanische Bundesstaat. Doch, das ist Europa, nicht Amerika. Doch. Habe ich nicht Dallas im Fernsehen geguckt? Habe ich nicht Grandmaster Flash auf der Berliner Mauer gelesen oder Breakdance auf einer Hamburger und einer Frankfurter Straße gesehen? Kommen Sie aus Amerika? Nein, ich komme aus der nächsten Welt, die mit der Rot, Weiß und Schwarz verbunden ist. Und warum sind Sie hierher gekommen? Ich habe meinen Urgroßvater in Weiß gesucht, aber ich habe das andere Deutschland gefunden, in Rot und Grün, und wir haben unter einem Stern zusammengesessen und dieses Buch gemacht. Thank you.
So I'd like to welcome all three of you back to the stage, Jamel, Folashade, Melba. We have about 15 minutes for discussion, which would allow another 10 minutes of coffee discussion so we can continue outside, but I'd like to open it up to questions.
I'd like to ask all three of you, given the fact that for sure the existence of black Germans is something now Germany has to deal with, how long do you think before black Germans will be a really viable political force? Politics the way we think of politics, protecting laws?
Yeah, actually, this is a question I cannot really answer because to become a political force, to be a political force, well, we are a minority, and so I don't really know if it's. I'm wondering what we would have to do in order to be a political force. Should we change our strategy? Should we do something different? But I think then I would then focus more on majority society because it also depends on if we're talking about racism. As like for anti-racist work, I think Black people have already and Black political organizing have already played a crucial part in making racism a topic in itself, because it used to be a taboo, and now things are getting a bit better in the way that we can now have at least discussions around racism a little bit. But I'm not really sure what are the criteria to be a political force? Because as I already said, the things we're saying now, that we're talking about racism, this is actually something that has been going on for decades already. And I'm not quite sure what needs to be changed. And I think it's rather the majority population that kind of, and its resilience against anti-racist work that are determinants for whether or not we can be a force, because resistance has always existed and will always exist. Yeah.
I'm trying to think how to ask this question. And I think it's about chronology or temporality or something like that. So I was very moved by the way, Melba, by the way your poem ended. Ich habe das andere Deutschland entdeckt in Rot und Grün. Now, I'm a 68er too, so that's part of the reason it moved me. But that's the year before Audre Lorde was there, and the moment at which the Black German movement emerged. And so I'd be interested in people talking about how what seemed to be the other Germany in red and green, how it failed the Black German movement, or how it refused to address issues, both the left and Greens, how race hasn't been a significant enough dimension or aspect of that politics. And maybe that would be something you could answer from an ISD.
Yeah, no, I can't answer that question. But I was actually there the same time that Audre was there. And we gave a reading. German American Studies Association had a conference in Berlin in the spring of '84. And Audre was teaching at the Universität at the same time. And actually, I was there for some days, and I, met with Audre and her students. And I don't know, I think that in terms of the failure of the movement, because I've only gone back and forth. I do know when I go back to Bremen, where I'm in Frankfurt or visiting old friends or speaking or whatever, that they feel that the things have changed and not necessarily did not go in the direction they wanted it to go. And I'm not a political scientist, and I haven't really, studied all of the dimensions of those shifts. but I think certain things have happened in Germany itself. I felt like, or it seemed as if politics were more progressive when Germany was split into East and West. And I found that the persons who were active, who viewed themselves as socialists or viewed them part of the Green Movement, they were much more critical, and they actually were much more um, of issues around race and so forth. But, you know, like you say, it's temporality, right? I mean, things have changed. You know, we know that well, just in terms of more recent events in the United States. So I'm not really sure. I can't really give you an answer for why. But I think that we've seen sort of a slack in kind of across the board as far as that's concerned. You want to speak to that?
Yeah, because it's 50 years, 68, and at least in Europe, there's a lot of programming around this idea of 68, and many people are jumping on this decolonize 68, and I'm part of a project that's called Decolonize 68, and I have, 8 months to try and decolonize 68. And whenever I'm asked about it, what I say is, how can you decolonize 68 if we haven't decolonized 2018? So I think that it is a question of temporality, that the past is in this present and the future is also in this present, and there are many people in this room who work on Afrofuturism, like Priscilla Lane, and this is, I think, especially for the Black experience, very much true. So we have another question from the audience. Karina.
Hi, yeah, I was wondering, this question is for Folashade. Yeah, did I butcher that? I'm sorry. And you mentioned that colorism and anti-Black racism within other racialized communities in Germany is a subject that hardly comes up in social justice spaces. And I was wondering why you think that is and where the conversation is now. Because I often wonder, this idea of when are we becoming a political force? I think it's not necessarily our job to fix racism, right? But do you feel like the conversation has evolved in terms of colorism within the Black German community or ISD, and how are the connections being drawn to other racialized communities? And how are we fighting within the ISD, at least, this idea of anti-Black racism from other racialized groups?
So I think in general in Germany, it's a bit difficult having conversations within racialized communities, because we are racialized and we are minorities, and then it's also this thing that we want to fight racism, and then there's this assumption that we have to stick together. I mean, there's solidarity is necessary, but then having conversations about discrimination, different forms of discrimination, talking about gender or class, ableism, is difficult to have, but then specifically within anti-racist social justice spaces by racialized communities itself and members of racialized communities, it's a very difficult topic, and I think we haven't found really a solution yet on how to deal with it. Because for once we are working towards the same goal, but then how do we get there? This is the big question. In general, always coming to political mobilization. And yeah, I think it's more, for now, it's more like a pragmatic stance that it's like, yeah, we have to be, I mean, this identity creation, formation in general of who is that, how are we, how do we come to be a we? We should and have to work together, we have to be in solidarity with each other, but what is being addressed, who, and also, yes, as I said, the power dimensions, I feel are often not talked about because there's also, yeah, even now I'm struggling to find words because it's so difficult. But then thinking of how anti-blackness is not addressed coming from different communities is often, not only is it not talked about, but it's kind of, it kind of, well, thinking of the solutions is like we're trying to work in coalitions and have strategic alliances with different organizations, both racialized communities as well as majority society organizations, and then colorism within the ISD or Black social justice spaces in general. There are some efforts to talk about it, but I don't really think it's happening yet. Yes.
Could continue on this. In America, the largest, or no longer the largest, minority group or racialized group were African Americans. Now it's the Latinx community. In Germany, it's clearly not the Afro-Germans, it's the Turks. And I'm curious, what's the relationship between those two communities, and now that you took in 1 million Syrians, that's another huge racialized group. So and they're brand new. So I'm curious about what that is. You seem to be talking around. I'm wondering what it looks like there between those groups.
Yes, okay, trying to think about the answer and if I really have an answer to this. So in general, I think, yes, now it's many, in the so-called refugee crisis, there are many people seeking asylum seekers and refugees in Germany, but what I see more is that the kind of discussions that we have are the same. So it's always about the newly arrived, and so of course we have to be in solidarity with each other and support each other. But also I think that what is now a big challenge is that the whole issues of racism now is framed as a topic within migration, and not as part as German society at large. And of course, different forms of racism, anti-migrant sentiments and policies have to be addressed, and we have to work together. But what I really think is that now it's about this whole integration discourse that we continue to have every 5 years, and yeah, and how yeah, I mean, also within then the the refugees, they're different. So there are a lot of people from Syria, but then now it's now then when talking about how I'm sorry, I think I kind of lost my.
That's
Yeah.
actually, I would say I really invite everyone to stay for Fatima Al-Tayyib's talk after the break, because and I can't read the future, I don't know what you're going to talk about, but in knowing your book Undeutsch, you talk about this as well, and this idea of the different hierarchy between refugee claimants. You know, the idea that an economic refugee claimant, which is, you know, often people who are coming from the continent of Africa are sort of considered lower than refugees coming from war-torn countries, that there's this kind of hierarchy. And even further than that, also this idea of what you were trying to get to, of like always being brand new, always trying to reinvent this story as if it's just arriving, whereas it's been a story. And that's, I think, also great about this panel. We're talking about really 3 different time periods. So the early 80s, and then when you're speaking about Bremen Okpako's film, we're talking, you know, about the 90s, and you're giving us the present day, but we're seeing these same kind of topics coming up again. So I would ask a question, maybe again, bring it back to colorism, what Kavina brought up, and hair, because I think, you know, with this natural hair movement, this is also kind of a topic in terms of colors, because black hair is almost as diverse as diverse as black skin, and there is also a fetishism of a type of black natural hair. And I wonder if you could speak about that and your project, maybe in conjunction with like YouTube videos and self-care.
Yeah, in another form of this paper, the longer form of this paper, I go into a specific YouTuber called Johanna's Essentials. That's her channel. And she is fair-skinned. She's from Cologne and has those big curls that, again, like the closer you are to whiteness is then the more desirable you are. And so that equates also to hair and skin color. And so her channel is very popular, and I know that's also part of it. And other YouTubers who are darker and who do have other curl patterns have talked a lot about the discrimination in between viewership, and then have had to move on. And like Francesca Ramsey is one person who did a lot of lock tutorials and other types of videos, and now she's kind of, you know, moving on to other spheres. And so it seems like those people end up stopping for whatever reason and aren't really continuing, or continue doing something else, like being a makeup guru then, or being something else. And so that's definitely a huge problem. And what I thought was interesting with Sammy Deluxe is that here we have someone who is black but has straight hair, and that though he wasn't teased, or the teasing was kind of taken back from him, then I guess I can't call you the N-word, but that these kids are like trying to process his hair and like these signifiers of blackness that don't quite add up for him. And so it's all very interesting to think about, again, the projections, which we've been talking about, projections that are put on you, and then also what people are willing and wanting to consume. I will, though, say that Johanna's Essentials, what she does is has other people with other curl patterns on her channel, and have videos completely with them where they completely speak and where she's off screen and it's just about them. So that's also something that she tries to do to increase self-love about, you know, your own curl pattern. And then she also will have men on too, and talk about men's hairstyling and men's curl patterns. So I think that those are attempts and signals to try to recognize that and promote self-love.
It's interesting that this, we have another question here, that this, you know, showing your curls is then considered an embodiment of resistance. I was just forced to watch a bit of the Miss America pageant with my mom, or the Miss USA pageant, and the woman from last year, you know, she came on stage and she was like, now I'm wearing my curls. And it was really such a big deal that she was wearing her hair natural. So of course, we turned it off when the last black contestant was voted off. Is there a question over here? Oh, great.
I guess it's me. On that same topic, thank you, Jamel, for that. So much to think about. I was wondering what you thought, if you could talk a little bit more about the Yana Paragis film. I think I'm getting her name right, because I saw it, and I you know, my subjective judgment was that she comes across as really superficial to me, and you know, I'm wondering if you could give your own critical reading. I know it's kind of putting you on the spot, or if you could talk about how that was received in, you know, I don't, this might be really impossible to answer, but if you could talk about how it was received in Germany, or if there was kind of a follow-up to that, like was this a watershed moment and so on, or was it in any, even in some way, did it generate some interesting conversations? Because she kind of has good hair, right? if I'm not mistaken. I think I've only seen it once, right? But she can have those loose curls. And she comes across as kind of, I mean, from a sort of critical point of view, I feel like she's problematic. She's a problematic figure in Black Germanness. So I'm wondering if you can just tell us anything about that.
Yeah, I did have to watch it a few times to kind of get interested in the film. I am also based in the United States, so I don't know about the German reception of the movie, but maybe other people can speak to that. But she does go to ISD, and she is part of that community, so that also kind of informs how I think that she's trying to take it, and speaking to a lot of different activists within the film. Like there were moments, like there was an attempt. You know, it's a 45-minute documentary that I initially watched because I wanted to use something in the classroom, right? So that was also my whole even desire to do is like, I'm teaching German 300, let me, what can we want, you know? So what I though just found so interesting was this kind of transformation of wearing her hair straight and being this Deutsche Welle journalist, and then, you know, in the middle of the film, you know, going to this Afro shop, and which is also a contested space and a space where you can buy also bleaching creams and relaxers and all of these other types of things, but that she does learn about it, or you know, is looking at the shampoos at least, and is this acted, like how much, like how stylized is this performance? But I think it's an attempt to declare this type of hair beautiful, and as you say, she does have a specific curl pattern, definitely, and I definitely see that, and I'm so struck though that she still straightened her hair the whole time, because it doesn't take a lot for her hair to become straight. But again, it's, you know, talking about these white beauty standards, talking about being on TV all the time and what is consumable for viewers. I think that she's like playing with a lot of that type of tension in her career, and then also throughout the film, and bringing out these like absences and secrets in multiple different ways through other activists and other artists that she talks to. So I'm trying to be generous in yeah.
We have time for one last question or remark.
Yeah, I guess, is this on? Yeah. I mean, I guess I would be generous, because I think, I mean, in her job, that is radical. And I guess that, you know, this comes back to this question that I have, and I'm saying this as a mom of Black children, this, you know, the ways in which I feel like the Black community sort of decides who can and who can't be Black is always like, oh, this is affecting my babies. And so I look at it as an outsider, but I think if you're on TV, it is really radical to straighten your hair in Europe and show your hair that way. And I was also, I mean, I find your work and Jamel on hair really fascinating, and this notion of self-love, and that it's so much more difficult in Germany because the products aren't available the way they are here. You have to make your own. And these house guests that I had who are active in the ISD they went to Walmart when they were visiting us, and they got all these products, and they were just like, I can't believe it's so cheap, and we have all these products, and they bought them. And then, interestingly enough, an African-American man came up to them and asked them who they were and where they were from, and asked them if they were Black. And he said, well, and then they said, what do you think? And he said, well, one of you is more mixed than the other. So they were sort of embracing this Blackness, and he was telling them that they weren't really Black, they were mixed. And so it was this really interesting moment of identity formation and identity denial. But I wonder if you, in your work, do you deal with just the availability of products and how much more work it is to have natural hair?
Yeah, in the longer version of this paper, Johanna's Essentials, also she talks about going to Rossmann, and that now they sell the Cantu products at Rossmann. I don't know if they sell them at DM, but so that's a natural hair brand that's kind of, I mean, I don't know how natural the products is and how many chemicals are in the product, but Yeah, but she does talk about when she does different product reviews, like this is available if you go on Amazon.uk, or if you're in England, this is available here, this is available in Germany, and this you can go to the Afro shop and buy this one. And so she's very deliberate about getting people access to different products and where they can find them, which I also find very useful and practical information, because like even when I was studying abroad there 2 years, I was like, you know, like I couldn't find makeup, I couldn't find anything for my hair, you know, so that type of information is needed, and relaying that information, right? Like how do we, and I think that gets to also what you were saying, is like, how do we relay this knowledge and pass it on and make sure that people are getting access to this knowledge, right? And it's not just dying and then you find it when you're 22, when you know, right? We could have used all of this knowledge earlier too, so.
Please join me in thanking our guests. This was really... And we have about 10 minutes for a little coffee break, and I urge you to please be on time back here at 3:30 for our keynote. Thank you.